Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the January 9th PCAS, Pacific Coast Archaeological Society General Membership Meeting via Zoom. And tonight we have Dr. John Johnson, and he's going to be speaking. The title of his talk is Mapping Chumash Communities. Dr. Johnson served 37 years as curator of anthropology at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, and since retirement in 2023 holds the position of curator emeritus. He taught an anthropology course on indigenous peoples of California and Indians for 18 years at UC Santa Barbara. Dr. Johnson's written contributions include more than 100 studies regarding the cultures, history, and ancient past of California's native peoples, especially emphasizing the Chumash Indians of the Santa Barbara region. I want everybody to give a warm welcome to Dr. John Johnson. It's all yours.
Okay, I'm going to share the screen here. And let's see here. Okay. So in my talk tonight, what I'm going to do is discuss this whole process of how people over the years have mapped the Chumash region, and particularly where towns and villages were located at the time that Europeans arrived. And I'm going to go into the history of how people have been doing this mapping over the years, starting with the first Spanish explorers. So what you see in front of you right now is an artist's reconstruction. This is by Russell Ruiz of what the Goleta Valley looked like at the time that Europeans first arrived. His vision of what that looked like, and a little later on we'll explain how he came up with this particular view. It's based on an early map from the mission times. So I'm going to deal with several topics here in the process of telling this story. I'm going to talk about the Chumash as a whole, as an ethno-linguistic region. I'm going to then go through the different Spanish maps that documented where Chumash towns and villages were located. I'm going to then talk about how we can use mission records for reconstructing ethnogeography, the Chumash ethnogeography of the Chumash region, and also how anthropologists have gone about mapping and what kind of sources of information they've used, and then how they have used these maps to understand what took place during the mission period, how people became chronologically incorporated into the missions. And I'm going to talk about how we can map population distribution and densities, and how you can use the map once you get these maps and the locations pinned down of where the different Chumash communities were located. You can study then intervillage relationship and social organization, and how people interacted with each other. So just to give you a little background, this is a map showing the different culture areas of North America on the left, and then on the right, just looking at the Western North America and looking at the distribution of language families in Western North America. And one of the things you immediately notice is that there's a high linguistic diversity here in California. And these are not individual languages, these are language families. And there were something like linguists say about 75 different indigenous languages spoken in California. And in the Chumash region alone, there were 6 languages. So down here in South Central California, on the map on the right, you can see the Chumash region. And Chumash is not the name of one people. Actually, it's a series of people who all spoke related languages. And so this is how over the years we've divided up the region uh, where these different peoples live. And uh, there are, you'll see here, there's actually 8 different groups that are shown, but at least we know that the Migdiano Castec Chumash in the upper right, these people were spoke probably an interior dialect of what linguists call the Ventureño language. And the Cuyama Chumash are a question. We don't know exactly what they spoke. There's been no surviving vocabularies of the Cuyama Chumash or texts in that language that the missionaries recorded. So there's really 6 different distinct languages. And the linguists tell us these are not just dialects, they're actually distinct languages. And some of them were quite divergent, like that spoken up in the San Luis Obispo area. It was not mutually intelligible at all with other Chumash languages. Okay, well, then into this region, we have the Spanish enter in 1542 with Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo's voyage. And this is some of you may have seen this ship. It's at the San Diego Maritime Museum. It's a replica of Cabrillo's flagship, the San Salvador. And so Cabrillo, in the various accounts, and we don't have his original diary or journal. What we have are sort of a combined account brought together from different journals that were kept during Cabrillo's voyage, and they were copied down by a missionary down there in Mexico after they returned, and that's the surviving account we have of Cabrillo's voyage. And he lists a whole series of Chumash town and village names that they encountered during his voyage in that surviving account. So that one of the things we do know is that he gave one of those villages the name of Pueblo de las Sardinas, and that's the first uh, Chumash town that appears on a Spanish map, and that's in 1559. And the Pueblo de las Sardinas is actually the name of the for Siuktun, which was the big Chumash uh, settlement on the Santa Barbara waterfront at the mouth of Mission Creek in Santa Barbara. And so he was given lots of sardines when they went ashore, and so they called it the Pueblo of the Sardines. The next mapping that took place occurred during the voyage of Vizcaíno in 1602. And this is the map of Vizcaíno's, the missionary that was with Vizcaíno did the sketch map, and it shows the 3 largest of the northern Channel Islands on the off the coast, and it has different places noted along the mainland, and one of those is the right there, the Pueblo Grande, which is probably Dos Pueblos on the coast, up coast from Santa Barbara. And it was the largest Chumash or 2 Chumash towns on either side of the creek there that the name Dos Pueblos comes from. Also on this map, there's other places noted along the mainland. For example, it says Coast of Friendly People, referring to the Chumash Indians living along the coast. And then also here on Santa Cruz Island is referred to as the Island of the Bearded Men. So that is the voyage of Vizcaíno. And now Vizcaíno's map that he made was not published for 2 centuries. He did this map in 1602, and it includes many of the same names that appear on that sketch map by the missionary, including Pueblo Grande for Dos Pueblos, probably. Then he says the next note along the coast it says Costa de Arboleda. In other words, it's a forested coast or wooded coast. it might be referring to Montecito area. And then he also shows again the coast of friendly Indians, and he shows the island of the bearded men as Santa Cruz Island. So this wasn't published till 1802, but it was actually originally created in 1602. So there weren't any other maps that really were original that were made of the Chumash region until the expedition, the first Spanish land expedition in 1769. And so we have then Miguel Costanzo, who is an engineer on accompanying the Portola expedition, as it's called, and they went up the coast. And in Costanzo's diary, he actually obtained Chumash names for 3 of the islands off our coast. Uh, and these have been interpreted, these 3 names, uh, apparently are one for San Miguel Island, one for Santa Cruz Island, and one for Anacapa Island. But he actually named these islands differently than they're named today. The island of Santa Cruz was given the name that it still has, but the island of San Miguel was really Santa Rosa Island, and the island what is today San Miguel Island was called San Bernardo. He also shows on the map there's Morro Bay up here, and he calls Morro Rock the Punta del Estero. And then he has here he shows the Sierra del Buchon, and Buchon was the very powerful chief who lived in we think right around the area of Pismo Beach or Arroyo Grande, and he had other villages in the area were paying tribute to him, and he apparently held sway over a large geographical area in that San Luis Obispo region. And so this is the first time we see a Chumash name being a name referring to a Chumash chief appear on a map. Okay, well, one of the great things about the Portola expedition is they came as they moved up the coast. They estimated the number of people living in each village. They estimated the number of houses. They described the number of canoes or tomals that were present in each Chumash town along the coast. And one of the interesting things is when we can, at least for those towns in which they made gathered such descriptions, you can see that there's about 4,000 people, at least in these particular Chumash towns. This isn't a complete list. And then counting the number of canoes, and you can see that there's 40 people for each tomal or each canoe. So these boats, the tomal was very important to Chumash subsistence in terms of the number of people, number of fish that they were catching is being distributed to probably at least 40 people. And we have then after Costanzo's map and the Portola expedition, we then have the expedition of Anza, who brought a group of settlers up to found what became the Pueblo of San Jose, the town of San Jose. And so along with Anza was Father Pedro Font, who was a cartographer. And Font kept a very detailed diary. And so here's the portion of Font's resulting map that shows the Santa Barbara region. And he has the islands a little misshapen, not exactly right, but you can see what's interesting is that each day of the expedition he has numbered on this map. So you can see exactly where they were, and you can then have his diary. You can go and read what he was seeing on that day at that location. And so you can match those Chumash rancherias or towns with the what he just says in his diary about the people there. And one of the excuse me just a minute. One of the incidents that occurred on the expedition was when he came to Santa Barbara, to Siuktun, the big town on the Santa Barbara waterfront, and he mentions that there was a group of Indians out fishing, and when they came ashore, they took the whole boat load of fish on their shoulders and carried it to the chief, who was distinguished from the others. He was the canoe owner, but he was also probably a high-ranking individual in that society, maybe even the chief of Siuktun, and was distinguished from the others by wearing a full cape. So while Font and Anza was coming Anza up the coast to Monterey and eventually to where they founded San Jose, he there was another missionary, a missionary named Father Francisco Garces. And Garces also entered California, but separate from Anza. Anza uh, went a southern route from the junction of the Colorado River and the Gila River, where the Indians, they called in those days the Yumas, or we call them today the Quechan people, were living, and then crossed over to San Gabriel and took a southern route. Well, Garces took a northern route through the Mojave Desert and accompanied by the Mojaves. So Garces went, he was left behind by Anza among the Quechan people. And he was very interested. He wasn't interested in staying put. He wanted to go out and meet Indians and gather information about them. And so he went up to the Mojaves and then accompanied by a few Mojaves and an Indian from Baja California, they crossed up the Mojave River uh, into um, reach San Gabriel Mission, and then they went uh, over into the Antelope Valley, crossed the Tehachapi Mountains, and in crossing the mountains, he met a group of people he called the Quabahai. And you can see here they are shown on the map, the Quabahai, right there. And then he went into the San Joaquin Valley. He was trying to find a way to Monterey, and he went northward among a group of Indians he called the Nochis, who would be Yokuts peoples in Central Valley of California. Now, this map was made after he returned in January 1777. He returned to San Javier in what is now Arizona, and that was his home mission at the time. And then he visited with some other missionaries also in that northern Sonora region, and one of them helped him put together this map. And the other thing shown on this map, though, is all of the Chumash region. See all these symbols, these town symbols, showing the number of different towns and villages that existed in the Santa Barbara region. He didn't actually visit this region, but he was told about it by Father Pedro Font. I love this map because the whole map itself, this is only a portion of it, shows the positions of all the indigenous groups in what is today Arizona and some of them in California as well. So Father Pedro Font also produced a map, and he and Garces got together and compared notes. And so they're back down in Sonora now. And this is after they've made their trips. And so this is the map that Father Pedro Font put together. And what's interesting about this is that, well, here's the part that just includes the Chumash region. He includes the native group names, and he shows the routes of travel of both Garces and also of Anza on here. And he shows the Mojaves there. They call them Ha Mojave. And then he shows a group over here after Garces had the crossed down here to San Gabriel and then went up to the Tehachapi Mountains. He shows a group north of Garces, group called the Coahi, which would probably be Coayasu, the group that we know as the Coayasu today. And then they go into the San Joaquin Valley, and he shows the Nochis, the Yokuts. But then he's moved the people that Garces called Quabahai to the coast. And he's calling that what today we know as Chumash, he's calling them Quabahai. But actually, this is a misunderstanding. Garces, when he visited the Katanamook in the Tehachapi Mountains, he saw that he describes the large houses that they have, all of the shell beads and ornaments that they had, and other things that impressed him very much. And when he got back and was meeting with Font was describing the same sorts of material culture that he had seen in the Chumash, coastal Chumash towns along the Santa Barbara Channel. And so they came to the conclusion, or at least Font came to the conclusion, that the people he saw must be called Quabahai. But actually, um, um, Alfred Kroeber, in the early 20th century, in his interviews with some of the Mojave Indians, uh, collected the name Quabahai or something so very close to that as the name for the Katanamook. So it's a misunderstanding that the name Quabahai got moved to be refer to the Chumash. Okay, another mistake is this designation here. This is the Ventureño, and it's being placed in the Santa Monica Mountains. And actually, we know this is the name that we know today as Vanyame, which is the desert Serrano people of the Antelope Valley. And so Garces mentions them in his diary, but they've been misplaced by Font when he came up with this map and placed it in the wrong location. And then this, ever since, has had consequences in being further. Um, there's another map. Oh, I should also mention that also down in the southern San Diego area, he also shows the group we call today the Kumeyaay, and he calls them Kumeya. So here is then a 1781 map, just 4 years after that map that Font put together. Here's a map that was published that had combined, again, the observations of Font and Garces. And again, they misplace the names of the native groups. They put, well, they have the Nochi, the Yokuts in the correct location, but they put the Quabahai again in the Chumash region, and they put the Benyeme here in the Santa Monica Mountains or the Ventureño region, when really these are designations for people in the inland areas and interior for the Katanamook and for the Vanyame. Okay, well, also in 1781 we get the founding of the Mission Santa Buenaventura or its following year, excuse me, 1782, we get the founding of Mission San Buenaventura and of Mission Santa Barbara. And there were a series of maps that were made when at the time that they founded the Santa Barbara Presidio. And so this is a map showing the Goleta Valley. And you can see here that there are 7 different locations where clusters of houses are shown. And this corroborates descriptions of the Goleta Valley. And there was this large coastal lagoon that existed at that time. And um, that the scouts reported to Portola that there were 7 different Chumash locations where Chumash Indians were living around in the Goleta Valley. And this is corroborated by this Pantoja's map. Pantoja was the captain of the ship. And so he was mapping different locations along the coast. So we have here this group of towns here, which actually 4 different locations where he shows clusters of houses. And this was the basis for Russell Ruiz's artwork that I showed at the beginning in my title slide. That would be the view looking from Moore Mesa across to Mescaletan Island and also to the other community across from it on the shore of the estuary. And then right here is where UCSB was later established. This is where the campus is today. And then finally, there's this cluster of houses to the north, uh, which is downtown, today is downtown Goleta, uh, right? And this is the largest cluster of houses. And the mission records corroborate that this town had more people living in it than any of the others around the Goleta Lagoon. So he also, um, Pantoja mapped other locations along the coast, and this is in Coho Bay, underneath Point Conception. And you see here there are four different locations where clusters of houses are shown on this map, which he, in his notes to the map, he says these are the rancherías de los Indios. And um, we know, though, from later accounts from the and during the mission times, that all these people were considered to be part of one social political group. They were under a single chief, and uh, and the name of this group, or the name of this group of rancherias, was Shisholup. So um, it shows that these names that appear in the mission records don't always appear to one archaeological or don't always correlate with one archaeological site. There can be several different archaeological sites that may be places, residences, or residences of people who were part of the same social political group. And then other interesting descriptions on this map. Here it's saying this is the point on the coast where the Indians do fishing. So he's giving you a couple other interesting observations. And then we have the final map along the Santa Barbara Channel coast that Pantoja made. This is of the Santa Barbara anchorage. And here he shows um, the Presidio of Santa Barbara that was just getting established. He shows the large coastal town of Siuktun at the mouth of Mission Creek. This is the same place that Cabrillo called the Pueblo de las Sardinas. And then there's also shown along the coast another group of houses at the mouth of Montecito Creek, which is Shalawa, the Chumash rancheria of Shalawa. And then just see, 11 years later, we have a visit to Santa Barbara of George Vancouver. And here's a drawing that was made during Vancouver's visit to Santa Barbara, showing where we actually see what things look like. On the lower left is the rancheria of Siuktun on the coast, the town of Siuktun. And then in the middle distance is the Presidio, and up on the upper right is the Museum of Mission of Santa Barbara, which is just at this point just about a little over 6 years old. Okay, so we've come to the mission period now, and you can see within the region where Chumash languages were spoken, there were 5 different missions that were established. And there were people speaking Northern Chumash who also went to Mission San Miguel in the Salinas Valley, and people speaking Ventureño Chumash from the Santa Monica Mountains primarily, who went to Mission San Fernando. So a total of 7 missions had people present who were speakers of one Chumash language or another. And we can use the mission books. For example, this is one of the registers of Mission Santa Barbara, and each of these books contains not only the names of the people who were baptized or married or buried at the missions, but also what rancherias they came from. And so we know we can get the names of all the rancherias that were occupied at the same time at the beginning of the mission. So the mission registers provide a lot of important information that help us with determining the ethnogeography, the settlement pattern at the time that the missions were established. So we can see all these different Chumash towns and villages that were contemporaneous with one another. We can then get an estimate that the population sizes of these towns and villages. We can reconstruct looking at marriages between people that existed prior to them coming to mission. And so we can see what the original social interactions were among different towns and villages. And we can thereby reconstruct intervillage relationships and interactions. And so what we've done, in addition to the mission record evidence that we have from the Spanish period or the mission period, we also have testimony of Chumash Indians themselves. And this is, let me just, so this is the Juan Estevan Pico shown on the left, and he was a well-educated man who was born to a Chumash mother and was a first language speaker of Ventureño Chumash. And but he had beautiful handwriting and was quite a talented and well-educated individual. And one of the things he did was to interview some of the elders that were then living in San Buenaventura about where all the different Chumash towns and villages were once located. And so you can see here's Point Conception. He starts number one with Point Conception on his list and gives his Chumash name, Umkak. And then he says he goes down to the two rancherías, two of those locations where houses are shown on that 1782 map by Pantoja, and he gives the name Upap and Shisholop for two of those residential areas. And then he goes on down rancheria by rancheria, giving their Chumash names all the way down the coast. And he lists the two Dos Pueblos, Miku and Cuyamu, and then the four different towns around the Galita Slough or the Galita Lagoon. And he then continues, so he goes down into Ventura County and goes inland in the Ventura area, and came up with this remarkable list. And his um, his understanding of his language and how you represent the different sounds in the Chumash language were very sophisticated. In fact, more accurate than those of linguists or people who were collecting vocabularies in the late 19th century. And so Pico's list is very important because some of the rancheria locations that he documents here from the elders were not remembered by the time ethnographers began to interview elders in the early 20th century. Okay. So this now, Pico's list then was used by later anthropologists. And so one of those was Alfred Kroeber. And this is Alfred Kroeber's working map where he was trying to locate where different Chumash place names were along the Santa Barbara Channel mainland coast. And so this is Kroeber's working map that's up there at the Bancroft Library. And from this, a lot of this is based on Pico, but also other sources that he was using. And this is then ended up as the map that's included in his classic Handbook of the Indians of California, showing these locations. But many of the reason why he knows the names of these and where they're located is because of Juan Estevan Pico. And but Kroeber wasn't the only ethnographer, of course, doing research. His contemporary was John Harrington, and John Harrington recorded place names. He was really interested in place names and where the Chumash rancherias had been located. And so this is Harrington sitting on the step of the home of Rosario Cooper, shown on the right in Arroyo Grande. And Rosario Cooper was the last living person who was a speaker of the Northern Chumash language, and Harrington worked with her. And some of the place names of the northern area were obtained from her. He also worked with other Chumash Indians, of course, in his efforts to record the names of and places where different their Chumash names. And so this is Fernando Librado. He would oftentimes go with these people on place name trips. He took Juan Justo, for example, from Santa Barbara up on a train to San Francisco and would record the names of the canyons that Juan Justo remembered in the Barbareño Chumash language. And he did the same thing with Fernando Librado, going out in a horse and buggy with Fernando and recording names of places. This is a photograph that Harrington took of Librado at Point Mugu. But Harrington's information was never published. Most of it resided in his unpublished papers until after his death. And so other anthropologists had no way of tapping into this material for a long time in order to flesh out what we knew about where places were located. So along came then in the 1960s, Alan Brown, who was actually a professor of English literature, but was also very interested in the history of California and the early diaries that described the interactions between the Spanish explorers and the native peoples. And so Alan Brown recognized the importance of the mission records for getting an idea about names and locations of villages. And so this is his map, produced in 1967 in his monograph, Aboriginal Population of the Santa Barbara Channel. And the size of the circles now are showing the relative sizes of these Chumash towns and villages, which Kroeber did not show on his map. And plus there are many more locations because Kroeber was mainly using Pico's list for along the coast and on the islands, and didn't have the inland locations noted. And Alan Brown's work was soon updated by the work of Chester King. And this is Chester's publication in the Journal of California and Great Basin Anthropology, showing the names and locations of all these different Chumash villages in the region, or not all of the ones in San Luis Obispo area, though, however. And so he not only built on what Alan Brown had done, but also Chester by this time was able to access John Harrington's place name notes, and therefore, get accurate information about that Harrington had recorded. So this is 1975 when this is published. And then 25 years later, we undertook a project, and Chester was part of that too, and we consulted with linguists, and we came up with the first map, then including the San Luis Obispo region, the northern Chumash region, and the names of the villages up there, and then along with some refinements to what Chester had done and Alan Brown had done, and we came up with this map, also working with linguists to come up with linguistically accurate names of all the about 150 different Chumash towns and villages that existed throughout the entire region. And this was done as a contract or part of a study for the National Park Service in 1999. And once you have these locations known, then you can begin to do other kinds of studies. And so this is then plotting over time the spread of incorporation of people into the different missions. And you can see San Luis Obispo up in the north was founded 10 years earlier than the next mission, which was San Buenaventura. And as a result, there's an earlier incorporation of the population into that mission. Also, the villages up here are much smaller than they were along the main part of the Santa Barbara Channel. And then you have Mission San Buenaventura, Mission Santa Barbara, and you can see over time the spread of influence and incorporation of people into the missions, the depopulation of these areas as people move to the missions. And it's the people of the far interior, the Cuyama Valley and San Emilio Mountains come in last, and the Channel Islands remained apart the people of the Channel Islands remained apart from the missions until much later than the people on the mainland um, had had did. So, taking this approach, then um, my colleague Randy Milliken then wanted to look at the entire California, and he developed a database. I worked with him to uh, to look at all of the different areas that were depopulated during mission times and look at the rate of the percentage of people who were remained apart from the missions. And you can see that the missions pretty much along the coast, everyone, all those native rancherias, the people were closed out. The people relocated to mission settlements. But in the interior, they were only partially depopulated. Now, Randy had a approach where he divided all of Aboriginal California into different regions, and then he very carefully his vision was to come up with an atlas that would have all the information about each of these regions and come up with an accurate total or estimate of the number of people who lived in all of Aboriginal California. And so you can see here's his map of the regions, and one of them was the Santa Barbara region. And on the right, you can see the different regions and which indigenous groups were associated with each of those regions. And so this is then the Santa Barbara region. He called it the Santa Barbara Analytical Zone, and he divided then these different polygons to estimate the amount of people in each of the polygons. And so we would also applied because of the knowledge of which areas came to the missions earlier, when we knew that people were, because of introduced diseases, they were dying further away from the missions, we applied formulas in order to come up with an empirical approach to estimating indigenous population. And so this is what we came up with. The map here's the map that Randy came up with for all of California. Here on the right is Randy's map. This is an earlier map that was developed by David Hornbeck, which looks pretty similar to the one Randy came up with. But Randy's is more empirically driven, actually using the statistics of all of the people baptized from each of these little regions that he identified. And so this is the Chumash analytical zone. And you can see here, this is the result of applying this empirically based population estimate for calculating densities. And you can see that there's very high density along the Santa Barbara Channel. In fact, the highest density in all of Aboriginal California highest population density was in this region. But we also get high population densities on the Santa Cruz Island and Santa Rosa Island. However, this is maybe artificial because islands are smaller. There's not as many places for people to go, whereas people are concentrated along the coast, on the mainland coast. And so in drawing these polygons, we're including a lot of areas like the San Ynez Mountains, which are not permanently inhabited. And so we're artificially diluting the density that are in each of these polygons. And Mike Glasso and I have published a follow-up study where we argued that it's actually distance of coastline as opposed to population of people living along the coast, both on the islands and the mainland, that is a better measure of population density. And when you do that, the mainland coast here, right in the central part of the Chumash region, is where the highest population density were. Now, I also mentioned that another thing we can do is to look at intervillage relationships. So this is the largest Chumash town around the Goleta Slough, the rancheria of Saakpilil at the northern, right where downtown Goleta is today. And these are the number of kin relationships that someone from this village had with people from other villages. So in order to come up with a chart like this, you have to do a lot of um, kinship diagrams showing, using the data from the mission records to show how people, genealogical diagrams to show how people were related to each other in different villages. And one of the things you can see is that the people from Sukhtun had relatives on the Channel Islands, or from Soxpilil, excuse me, had relatives on the Channel Islands. They had relatives back into the San Ynez Valley, into the San Rafael Mountains, all the way back to the southern, to San Emilio um, Canyon in the at the margin of the San Joaquin Valley, up the coast towards Point Conception, and all the way east towards Santa Paula. So, and you can look at the frequency of relationships to show where the the strong social political connections were. So for Sacabillo, they had strong relations to a village that's on the upper San Ynez River, right around where Lake Cachuma is today, and then also to eastward to Siuktun, the main town on the Santa Barbara waterfront. And we can look at warfare then, the documentation of warfare that occurs during the Spanish accounts. And you can see which alliances of people are at war with which other people. And we know where these places were located, and you can kind of see different alliances emerge from studies like this. Like the people of Dos Pueblos were at war with the people at Galita. And we also see alliances that cross-cut the different environmental zones. So people on the coast often formed alliances with people in the inland, and this has probably also facilitated trade between two very different habitats. And then finally, we can looking at the relations between people from opposite sides of the Santa Barbara Channel, people on the islands and who their relatives were living on the mainland. And when you draw these lines, what you can see is that people were not, some of the earlier ethnographic work suggested that people were just crossing the channel, you know, from the east end of Santa Cruz Island to the mainland and from San Miguel Island to Point Conception. But when you actually look at the kin connections, you realize people were taking their tamals directly across the channel. They weren't just going one or two routes that were the shortest. So, in summary, the word Chumash refers to a region where these 6 related languages were spoken, and at least 150 separate social political groups existed. Spanish maps only occasionally depict rancheria locations prior to 1782, but those 1782 maps are really useful, and they illustrate that Chumash named social political entities sometimes comprised more than one residential community. The Portola expedition diaries document locations of Chumash rancherias that are mentioned then in later mission records, and mapping the locations of Chumash rancherias has improved over time by integrating multiple sources of evidence, the explorers' diaries, the mission records, and then the ethnographic records, including those compiled by Juan Estevan Pico, who is an Indigenous person himself, and also the people that John Harrington interviewed. And then once we have established these ranch locations, further studies become possible that bring in a geographic perspective. We can look at the colonial impacts on Indigenous communities and map these. We can estimate original population sizes and density of settlements based on the baptismal records, explorers' observations, and the census records from the mission period. And then finally, we can study intervillage social and political relations and instances of warfare by knowing where these villages were in looking at the geographic component of that. Okay, that's my talk, and so I'd be happy to entertain any questions anybody has. Should I stop share?
So I got two questions for you.
Okay.
Number one, and someone named Owen Duncan answered them in the chat about how they fished. And the second one is, what were the, I don't know how to put this politely, what were the courtship um, what were the courtship patterns, or how did they develop these relationships? Did they trade wives, or did they trade girls between tribes, or how did that go so they could, not interbreed with their, shall we say, their cousins or their whatever? You
Right.
understand the general question?
I do.
Thank you.
So the probably we know that throughout different times of the year, there would be times when people would come together from different um, settlements for fiestas, for gatherings, sometimes ceremonial, sometimes or there would be a social component to these. So people would meet each other from other villages when they come together for these festivals, and then there also trade would take place, and so this is, that's how people would meet each other, at some of these gatherings, and also probably during trading, when people would come across the Santa Barbara Channel in a plank canoe to trade with the people on the mainland and meet people there. In fact, practically every single Chumash town along the coast, between, say, um, down on the Malibu coast, all the way up to Point Conception, every single one had someone living from the Channel Islands living there, usually a male, usually a man, who had probably come over in a plank canoe, met a woman on the coast, and then married her. And they then, of course, having someone like that who spoke the island language living in your village would then facilitate the trade that was going on between the mainland and the islands, because the island language is not mutually intelligible with the mainland languages. They couldn't understand each other without a translator, even though the languages were distantly related, ancestrally related.
I have a
Did I
question.
answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
I have a question. Have any of the plank canoes ever, traces of the plank canoes ever survived?
Yes. Um, there have been a number of cases where canoe planks have been found in archaeological sites, and Lynn Gamble has published descriptions of these in an article in American Antiquity, where she actually um, took all examples that were in museum collections of plank canoes or planks, measured them, measured the diameters of the holes, also matched those to drills to see what drill types were used for drilling the holes, and so on. So yes, there have been studies, or there have been some finds of plank canoes or parts of plank canoes, and
How
including one. Yeah, go ahead.
how big were they? The ones that picture you had of them carrying it over their head looks like they could have fit quite a few people in it.
Well, there were different sizes according to Spanish accounts. Some were quite large where they could fit a number of people in, and others were smaller, just two or three. I think on the average, about two or three fishermen would sit in each plank canoe, but some were much larger than that. And
Uh,
the Portola expedition says when they visited Ventura, they said some tomals, plank canoes, went out to the islands to pick up people because to bring them to see the explorers, to meet with the explorers, and so those would probably be pretty large plank canoes.
okay, thank you.
Question. You mentioned at the very beginning and now just recently, six different languages, and they were not mutually intelligible. Is it kind of like French versus Chinese, or is it like somebody from Boston trying to talk to somebody from Scotland?
Well, might be closer to that last example. I mean, they all belong to the same language family, right?
Okay.
So the words are cognate in those different languages. And some of the languages are closer than to other languages. For example, the people in Santa Barbara and the San Ynez Valley spoke what linguists regard as different languages. They're different words for the same thing, but the grammar is pretty much the same. Well, even the grammar is a little bit different, but they could understand much of what each other said, so it'd be like, Spanish and Portuguese, maybe, where they were very closely related, and it wouldn't take long before you could get a facility in the other language, but they were still distinct languages. But um, but what you said about like Boston and Scotland, there were cases like that, um, where there was like a dialectical continuum, maybe from between Lompoc, and everybody could understand the people in the next village over, as you continued down all the way down to Malibu, say. But someone from Malibu would probably have a very difficult time understanding someone from Lompoc, you know. So there was once you get to the either ends of the continuum, they're very different. But everybody could probably, speak to the people in the next village over. So in that central Chumash region, not the northern Chumash, not the islands, but in the central Chumash region, there was maybe like a dialectical continuum from one end to the other. But linguists have parsed those out into different languages.
So sorry, go ahead. The food, what the people on the coast, was most of their protein from fish, and then the people from 10 miles inland was most of theirs from game, or what was the source of protein and carbohydrates?
Yeah, well, yeah, the people on the coast were fishermen by and large, and would hunt the marine mammals. Okay, also the marine birds. We find a lot of cormorant bones. I'm not sure I'd want to eat a cormorant, but they were very a popular um, food item on the islands, and they're also so we find the people on the coast were also harvesting shellfish, marine resources primarily, but they also had access to game from the mountains, and the people in the San Ynez Valley were you know hunting deer. We find some of the archaeological excavations that have taken place in the valley show there's a lot of deer bone in those deposits. Also rabbits, in inland game. And we also find, and of course, the oaks and acorns were really important, and other kinds of wild seed crops were really important. And we do find in the inland sites a lot of shellfish and a lot of fish bone, marine fish bone. So they're obtaining those by trade or going to the coast themselves, and under with permission from the people on the coast, and doing some fishing themselves and going back into the valley.
Do you think they had a cottage industry of drying fish?
Yeah, I'm sure they were drawing fish too. Yeah, and smoking them and so on.
Here's a question from the chat.
Okay.
What are estimates for those who escaped or refused missionization? I assume
Okay.
numerical
Yeah,
estimates.
this is a frequently asked question. So we do know that there were some people who did, opt out of and moved into the live with adjacent groups. But the adjacent groups were like the Yokuts, spoke a completely unrelated language, had somewhat different culture, and so those people who moved into those area and intermarried with them would I don't think it was a different culture, different habitat, and there weren't as many as some people might suppose. But it was some of that where people would opt out, wouldn't want to go live at the missions. But if a lot of your friends and relatives were already at the missions, you know, whether or not you bought everything that the missionaries were selling, you might still want to go live with your friends and relatives. And so um, there also, we know from the records that there was a more steady food supply that people would get at the missions, as opposed to hunting and gathering. If there were droughts or other things that occur from time to time, and your game is scarce and plant foods are scarce, makes the agricultural produce of the missions look pretty good. So there was a certain amount of moving to the missions, probably for for economic reasons.
John, I have a question. Did did um did moving to the missions have the same effect of exacerbating the spread of some of the old world disease, like they saw it in San Diego and Capistrano, or was there something idiosyncratically different about the Santa Barbara environment that was a little bit more insulating?
Yeah, no, the same thing happened in Santa Barbara that happened down further south there at those two missions. Um, there were, they didn't know about germs in those
Yeah.
days. Yeah,
Right.
so it was a mistake, concentrating people in one location where diseases can more easily spread, um, was part of the problem. And one of the tragedies of the mission period is that there's a very steep population decline that occurred uh, during those 4 or 5, 6 decades, during that period of time, where by the end of the mission period, there's maybe 10% of the population that had been there at the outset of the mission period. And the missionaries wrote about this, and said, how can we say we've done these people any good? Because we came here and the country was teeming with people, and now, there's just very few people alive that were here at the time that when we arrived originally, and comparatively. I will say that there was something different going on in San Diego a little bit, and in San Luis Rey a little bit, where people are living apart from the missions, and the missions established chapels in those different places, like Santa Isabel, inland from San Diego, or you know,
Yeah.
Temecula, Pala, for example. And so you do get a better survivorship actually in the inland areas of San Diego, what is now San Diego County, and because I think of a more decentralized approach. So everyone isn't being concentrated in one location, and therefore when a disease hits, it isn't, you know, impacting some of the outlying areas.
Thank you. Yeah.
Does anybody else have a question? Okay, if not, I'm gonna say thank you very much to Dr. Johnson. I'm gonna be giving you this certificate of appreciation from the society. I'll be sending
Thank
that. You can frame it and hang it on your wall. Take down your Picassos and put this up.
Okay. I'd, I'd like to make one a plug here. There's a new book that I've just finished reading. It's called Beyond the Devil's Road, and it's about Garces, who I talked about earlier, about Father Francisco Garces. I think it's a very good, interesting read. It's the first biography of him that has ever appeared. Is this book called Beyond the Devil's Road. Anyway, I recommend it for anybody who wants to learn more about this missionary who traveled in one year. He traveled 2,000 miles, mostly only accompanied by a couple, 2 or 3 Indians or small groups of Indians. And it's just a fascinating story, the story of Garces.
Thank you.
Okay. Next month in February, we're going to have Al Knight, a PCAS board member. The title of his talk is Santa Monica Mountains Rock Art and the Woolsey Fire. So hope to see as many people as possible next month. That's February 13th. That's Thursday evening. Thank everybody for coming. Drive home safely, and we'll see you again. Take good care. Good night.
Thanks, John.
Good night.
Thank you,
Good
John.
night.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.